to the podcast, Meg. I'm so
Thank
excited
you.
to
Thank
have
you.
you. So Meg and I know each other actually through our mutual friend, Katie Blummer. So Katie, she was also on my podcast talking about her working mom happiness program. So many of you may have already listened to her episode, but she's a mutual friend of ours. And Katie, when I was going through my separation, she was actually coaching me through being a working mom because I was kind of struggling with balancing everything. And I shared with her in one of our sessions that I was thinking about separating and I was really struggling with that. Just as a friend, I just kind of opened up to her. And I said I was, really scared and nervous, especially because of my kids. I think that's, for many people, that's the number one thing that you
Yes,
think about.
absolutely.
Is like, what about my kids? I think that's why people hold on as long as they do in marriages, because it's a big deal. And I came from a family of divorce. My parents divorced when I was 10 years old, and it was really traumatic for me. They had a high conflict divorce. And it was really
I'm
difficult.
sorry.
And so, yeah, so I was really scared and, I just needed help. I didn't know anyone in my life that had been divorced other than my parents. And so she put me in touch with you.
Yes.
And yes, and we had a couple of calls and I felt very supported by you. And it just made me go into separation and having the talk with my kids with more confidence.
Oh, good.
So I appreciate that. So I'm really
Oh, it
excited to
makes
have you
me,
on the
I'm so glad.
podcast.
Yes, I'm so
Great.
excited to be here. Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah. So before we kind of get into today's topic, I do like to ask all of my guests a question. So what is one thing that you did not sign up for?
Divorce.
Good one.
I thought when I was so excited just following you when we first met through Katie and when you launched your podcast. There's so many things that this
Yeah.
applies to, but just given our connection and that we talked specifically about uncoupling and divorce, it's like that is probably the first thing that comes to my mind, is which who does, right? No one gets
Yeah.
married planning to get divorced. So
No one gets married to get divorced. And I actually, when you say uncoupling, that's like a very specific word, and it's very interesting in using that word choice over maybe divorce or separating. Is there a reason that you use that term?
I've started using that term. If I go back to when, let's see, I got divorced over 6 years ago, but we had really started paperwork even, if I go further back, over 7 years ago. And we lived in that limbo land for a long time, stay or go, right? Stay married, get divorced. And I always came back to, you just stay married for the kids. That's how I felt. That's what I felt I had to do. If I tried to kind of, the further I went down that path of, I think divorce is our next right step. I think divorce is potentially brave. I think divorce would, maybe be better for the family. I would always just reach this crossroads of, we can't do that to the kids. What about the kids? What about the kids? And we'll get more into that later. But all that to say, in this couple of years of that limbo land, I just researched everything I could find. I read extensively on the topic, all the literature, all the studies, all the things, just trying to determine, like, can I protect my kids through divorce? And I don't know that it was one of the first books that I found. It was early on, but a really, and remains a super powerful one, is Conscious Uncoupling, that book. And
Yeah.
that was one of the first things. And I love that Catherine Thomas, she doesn't start by saying, get divorced, here's how. Here's these steps to uncouple. Like, part one is all about maybe what to try before you decide to uncouple, what to consider if, help you make that big decision. So, and then the second half are her 5 steps to a conscious uncoupling. So I think that resource was so instrumental in supporting me through the end of my marriage that I've started just using that term more regularly. I think I feel like that was so important that we intentionally uncoupled that concept of conscious uncoupling. So
I love that.
I
And
think,
you
yeah.
actually recommended that book to me. I'm pretty sure it was you because I did read at least the first half of the book.
Oh,
I'm the worst at audiobooks in general. It's like the ADHD thing. And then you know how it is being a mom and single mom. You
yes,
don't
you
have a
can
lot
read
of
a
time.
page here and a page there, and
Yeah. And then you
right.
just fall off. But I know that I made a point to really listen to that book, and I got a lot from it as well. And so I think that that's a really good place to start as well. And I like the word choice of uncoupling rather than divorce. It sounds a little softer. It sounds more
Mm-hmm.
intentional. I think a lot of people, even though I think on average it takes like 4 years or so for women to usually leave a marriage. It's like the
Oh,
average.
I believe it.
Yeah. And so, yeah, I mean, people aren't just leaving their marriages, but I think being intentional about once you do decide to divorce, now what does that look like?
Mm-hmm.
I love that a lot. What do you know? I'm trying to recall. This is a question that I get all the time. And I know it's not, maybe not like your expertise, but people ask me all the time, like, how did you know when you needed to leave? How did you know that it was time? Do you have any advice or any tips for anyone who is kind of in that should I stay or should I go position?
That's such a good question that I empathize so much with just the heaviness of that intersection because, like you just mentioned, so many of us will waffle at that decision for years because it's so huge with such far reaching implications and consequences. And so I'll share a funny story. In all my, trying to read and research and decide, I'm a huge Cheryl Strayed fan.
Okay.
And so at the time, she was hosting the Dear Sugar podcast. And so I had asked everyone, I had asked, really close friends. I didn't talk about it outside of my closest circle. But so, yeah, I talked about it with close friends. I asked Google all the time. I tried to pose my question in a search engine, like, how do you know? What do you do? And then I even wrote to Dear Sugar, right? Just this. And I knew, I'm like, this isn't even going to warrant the show's attention. And I had followed her for long enough. I'm like, she's already answered this, right? There's some core knowing somewhere that you're either ignoring or maybe you're a little out of touch with that core knowing. But it's scary because if you were to acknowledge or further explore that, it's probably going to ask a lot of you or ask for some action and it's going to be scary. I also, and this was some from, I have a background in education and psychology and had, learned at some point I went on during this phase to read more about it. But people typically, and this is going to be really a simplistic explanation, but stay in marriages or stay in, committed relationships out of love, duty, or structure. It's often some combination of those three things, but just starting to explore like why am I here? Why am I staying? Is right staying in this situation, staying in this relationship, is that in line with core values? Are there things that have changed, like for one or both of us, where we got to the point and right, that's a whole nother story, whole nother memoir, but just a series of life events where both my former husband and I are like, well, if we kind of knew then what we know now, we're, maybe two people that wouldn't have decided to get married so young
Yeah.
and would never do a thing differently, would never risk not ending up exactly where we are right now with these three beautiful humans that we get to co-parent together. But it just became more and more obvious that we were supposed to raise them as co-parents, not as married parents. And that's so terrifying to admit and acknowledge. And it's right. You just have to grieve this death of a dream and what you thought it was going to be. But for us, it became, and again, it took years. It wasn't clear overnight, which I think is important, right? I'm happy that it wasn't super impulsive, but it just became clear that the next step, the next honest thing, the next right thing for our family was divorce. And
Yeah.
then that's, yeah, opens a
Yeah.
whole nother can of scary conversations and decisions. And,
Yeah. So did you and
so
your husband, did you make that decision jointly, or was it one person who wanted the divorce and not? And if this is too personal, you can also decline.
no, I'm happy to talk about it. And he's He's honestly wonderful. And that did not happen overnight, right? I said we're kind
Right.
of like 7 years almost.
Wow.
And I've written about the experience, and he has been great to just trust me to, and he knows it's my story, it's my experience of the, uncoupling, which is different than his. But all that to say, yeah, he's been really great and given his okay for me to talk and share about it, my perception and experience of it. So we went back and forth, right? One of us would get a little more resolved that you break these cycles when you recognize them, right? If this is dysfunctional, you do something different. And so one of us would be really resolved, like, we need to get divorced. And then the other one would be like, no, no, we can't do that to the
Mm.
kids. That doesn't make sense. We will never make it work financially. We're not getting divorced. And then we'd switch. It was like this dysfunctional dance for a long time where it took a while for both of us to get on the same page. And I would torture myself with that because there's lots of research out there outlining the really negative or poor outcomes for children of divorced parents. So whenever we would kind of butt up against that, especially, we just be like, it's irresponsible,
Yeah.
right? There's no literature on, stay if you can make it work, stay if the kids don't see tons of fighting, which they didn't. I feel like we were co-parenting well as like while we cohabitated, but it just kept getting, I feel like we kept getting smaller and smaller, right?
Yeah.
So that research that existed was very real and very scary and would make both of us feel irresponsible for even contemplating divorce. But after a while, and I think that kind of goes back to that core knowing, almost core nagging of, is this real? Is this honest? Is this, what you're doing with this one life kind of thing? And so I would start wondering, I'm like, there's no research on what does it do to kids whose parents stay married for, right, that structure reason or out of duty, but they never see this genuine, healthy, romantic connection and relationship. And what if their parents are just getting dimmer and getting smaller because they've convinced themselves that trying to fit in this box of conventional marriage, traditional family is somehow better for the family? And I found just a lot of resources that were really helpful in terms of, and these are more anecdotal ones, right? We don't systematically study what happens to those kids whose parents stay married for them because we don't know who else doing that. I think
Mm-hmm.
it's safe to
Yeah.
assume a lot, right? But
Yeah.
so we don't have there's not the same data. But I did find a lot of stories of other individuals who it just empowered me or kind of validated what I was feeling to sometimes divorce is brave. Sometimes divorce leads to kids developing better relationships with both their parents, kids getting to know like brighter versions of both their parents. So that's, I don't know, did that answer the question?
Yeah.
It took a while because it's so scary. And then you can even get to the point where you're like, no, I think divorce is our next step, but that doesn't take away the scary financial decisions to be made
Right.
and right, just real life consequences either. So it's a lot.
Right. Yeah, no, that does answer the question. And I mean, I have so many thoughts there. So a lot of people will message me, like I said, on Instagram and ask that question, like, how do you know when it's time to leave? And like for me, it was really hard. It's hard in general for me to trust my gut. That's something that I have had to
Mm-hmm.
try to learn, and I'm still learning today on like trusting what is my intuition telling me. And it just did kind of get to the point for me, at least, that it was like just like acceptance. Like this is
Mm-hmm.
my life. This is going to be my life, and I either need to accept it or not. I mean, really just like trying to get in tune with like what my gut was telling me. Obviously no one can tell you. And I think I even had
Yeah.
conversation with you, Meg, where I was like, you just tell me like what to
Just
do.
tell
Like
me, please,
here's all
somebody
of
tell
it.
me.
Here's the
Yeah.
situation. I like laid it all out, tears and everything.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm like, what do I do? And everyone wouldn't tell me, you wouldn't tell. And that's the responsible thing to do, is no one can tell you when it's right, but really just trying to listen to your intuition. And then yeah, I mean, the effects on kids, and the number of messages I've received also from people whose parents have stayed together for the kids and have told me that they have issues in their relationships now as
Mm-hmm.
adults because a positive marriage and positive like romantic relationship was not modeled to them when they were growing up, and how they wished their parents would have gotten divorced and then they could have
Oh,
just lived in a happy
interesting.
home. Yeah, so there's definitely those families out there, and I mean it's complicated. A lot of people stay for financial reasons, like
Right.
we both know that's like
Yes, which is very understandable.
yeah.
Yeah, it's a big thing, big decision with huge consequences, and you have to that are going to affect kids as well, right?
Mhm.
So you can't just say, I think the kids would be better off. I will be more whole. I will be happier divorced, but our kid's going to have a place to live, right? You
Yeah.
can't separate all those questions and decisions.
Yeah, well, and I had another divorce coach on my podcast a month or so ago, Michelle Dempsey Multack, and
Okay.
she says your kids deserve a happy parent, not a married one, and
Yes.
that really like stuck with me, and I think it resonates with a lot of people too. Like you deserve to live a happy life. Your parents deserve to see parents who are happy and fulfilled in life. And then comes the complexity of co-parenting. So I
Right.
want to talk about co-parenting. So I know that you have a really good relationship with your ex, and I want to talk a little bit about that. How did you guys get on board to co-parent peacefully, and through the uncoupling process? How did you both get on board with that?
So lots of that came from we both were so concerned about the kids. And like from the very beginning, it was really important to us to prioritize their well being. And once we reached that point, like our experience was if we were being honest, we were staying married for the kids. And then reaching that place, like we were talking about, of deciding, like, kids, I don't believe will ever, once they're old enough to understand, right? Romantic relationships and adult love and decisions to get married or, participate in a committed relationship, that I don't think they would ever thank us. Like you said, you've heard from some of kids that grew up in this situation. Like kids aren't going to thank you for making them martyrs, right? That you
Right.
just stuck it out and I stayed married for you. And that's, even if they can't articulate it, I think the energy between, right, the two souls that make up that marriage, and if it weighs heavy, right? A struggling marriage just weighs heavy on you day in and day out, and I don't think you even realize until you're kind of out from under that weight. And there's no way that kids aren't feeling and absorbing that energy and heaviness too, even
Yeah.
if they aren't old enough to give it words. So, and maybe, we can circle back, but I have like my favorite example of my son finally being able to kind of speak about that in like 11-year-old language. But anyway, so I think our back to how did we um, end up in a place where we can co-parent really civilly, and I think it was just deciding it's not best for the kids if we stay married, right? We've decided that we're going to move forward with divorce. So how do we do that still putting them first, right? We've switched
Yeah.
the mindset. We thought we were putting them first by staying married for them. That's not sustainable. That's not working. We're going to get divorced, but they still come first. So I think from there, and I'm so lucky to have a co-parent who really shared that all important value of protecting just all the domains of their development, like social, emotional, mental, spiritual, all the things that you read about seeing go the opposite direction, the scary things that you hear about kids, um, whether it's developing behavioral problems or attention seeking behaviors or struggling academically as a result of maybe high conflict divorce. So, and I think I say I'm super lucky to have a parent who shared those same values. And I think that's actually pretty common. Everyone I've talked to wants to divorce this way, right?
Yeah.
They want a civil divorce. They want to protect the kids. They want all those things. And I mean, anybody who's navigated this knows that's so much easier said than done, because
Yeah.
as soon as the reality of divorce sets in, you are just triggered left and right. And
Yeah.
just I felt dysregulated all the time. So yeah, to have a co-parent who not only shared those same values, but was willing to put in the work to be able to honor those values and intentions was, I think, what allowed us to reach this place. And one that was huge, I had my own uncoupling coach through my divorce, which was just honestly life saving. And I really knew I had reached a point, I think, just sobbing on the bathroom floor. I'm like, I need help, right? Like, I don't know how to support my kids through this, much less myself get through this. And so I did. I found, and she was based out of Santa Barbara, California. And I did a number of consults because I was like, I need a good fit partnership to get through the next. I think I worked with her for 9 months through the divorce and after. And she encouraged me, and then my co-parent was open to it, to just be able to agree on like single intention. What can we agree on moving forward? And so the very beginning of the divorce journey, we both agreed we are going to filter words, conduct, everything through this question of how will this affect our family? How will this affect our kids? And it became countless times it was like impossible to remember to even do that, right? It's kind of that split
Right.
second. And
Yeah.
sometimes I was able to do it. Other times I was like defensive and cruel and, reacted in
Right.
ways that, and sometimes you learn like, okay, that really didn't feel good, that I slipped up. I want to do that differently. So, but yeah, now like 7 years later, it's become just a habit, right? Filtering through
Yeah.
that question, how will this affect our family? And that has really shaped, I think, our treatment of each other, like mine and my co-parents, and then also how we've moved on as this, you know, divorced family.
Yeah. Well, I think we're all human and we're going to make mistakes. And a lot of time you are put in a position where it's, you don't really pause. I mean, being in any type of divorce, even the best case scenario, I mean, emotions are high. Like you go
Oh,
through
so
like this
high.
very emotional experience, whether or not like you're choosing to get divorced, it's still very emotional because no one gets married to get divorced.
Mm-hmm.
And you're mourning the life that you thought you were going to have. You feel like a failure. There's so many things that are going on. And then what happens after that is then you're like really getting into it with, okay, well, what happens financially and what about
Mm-hmm.
custody? And so you're getting into like these, discussions with someone that you're uncoupling from that aren't comfortable. And then, but at the same time, you have to try to protect your children and be positive and mindful of them. But it's hard to do in those moments
Oh,
when
it's
emotions are high everywhere.
right.
Yeah.
And then you encounter that constantly, right? It is just like
Yeah.
day in and day out through really the thick of divorce that you are faced with having, right, those decisions of, okay, am I going to remember that intention and filter everything through that question? How will this affect our family? How will this affect our kids? Or am I just going to be impulsive and react and break down? And which, again, totally understandable. And like uncoupling coach was so helpful in helping me. I mean, I would vent to her, I would break down with her, I would save it for running and writing are like huge outlets of mine. But it wasn't just accidental, that it was so much work to shape
Yeah.
kind of where we ended up now. And I think any divorce and so many different circumstances, but and I've talked to many people getting divorced. I've worked in education for the past over 13 years, watched from a distance lots of people divorce, watched close friends get divorced. I really think, and granted, it's such a spectrum, but any divorce has the potential to go any direction, right?
Yeah.
Even a divorce that looks set up to be really amicable can get just horrifically messy
Yeah.
because we're humans, and we're just, to end a primary like core attachment is terrifying, right? Like I
Yeah.
think like your brain really thinks like I'm going to die, like this is a
Yeah.
life threatening thing. And so yeah, any divorce, I think you just from the beginning, and it sounds like, I don't want it to sound like pressure or intimidating, but it really has to start so early on. Otherwise it just gets easier and easier. Like the more you repeat a behavior, the easier it gets to just keep responding that way. And so I think if you're used to right? Maybe treating your
Yeah.
co-parent with tons of hostility, with, just being, there's so many different behaviors that are going to shape your divorce story. And you kind of got to be aware of all the time until it becomes easier, which it does, but it doesn't
Yeah.
feel like it will, right? There's
Yeah.
a time where it doesn't feel like it will ever get better. And that's scary.
Yeah. So how do you, let's say that someone is getting divorced. Let's say that they're all on board. They're like, okay, I want to consciously uncouple. I want to be respectful to my co-parent and have a
Mm-hmm.
great co-parenting relationship. Let's say that the other parent or the partner is high conflict for whatever reason. What would you recommend to that person and how to have the best co-parenting relationship possible when the other parent isn't on board?
Isn't on board. And I don't know if you feel like this, but I feel like I see that more often. I guess maybe you see
Yeah.
both parties high conflict a lot, but I feel it's most rare to see both willing to pursue this really conscious civil uncoupling. But a lot of times I think we see what you just described. One really wanting to be able to collaborate in that capacity, and the other just unwilling or unable, right? Just in a very different place. And so I feel like my divorce was just this massive surrender, right? Surrendering so much control, surrendering to the unknown, all these things that I'm going to lose control of. And I had a co parent that was on board, right? But I could
Yeah.
still potentially spiral at all I would lose control of. So if I thought my divorce was this big surrender, I will say it's second, like a distant second to this scenario of one parent wanting to divorce, like, well, if I can use that
Yeah.
adjective, and then one just who's going to be vindictive, who's going to put kids in the middle. I just can't. I will say I can't imagine being backed into that corner. I can't even say what I would do if I was backed into that corner, but feel like privileged. I've witnessed people pursue what's honest and show their kids that you break toxic cycles when you see them, and it is terrifying to lose control of what that other parent's going to do and what they might subject kids to. And so I think just remembering, like, going back to that circle of things I can control, right? I can control my conduct. I can show up as an authoritative parent and this safe space in their lives, and that doesn't mean I can protect them maybe from what the other parent is doing or gonna put the family through. And my biggest thing is I feel for these situations, but I would tell, right, both parents, tell anyone in those situations, like, do whatever it takes to get objective over what's fair, what's equitable, what needs to happen for the marriage to dissolve. And in these situations, that's I think, gonna look like you need a lawyer, you need a therapist, like, obtain the resources you need to determine, um, right, what that's going to look like, and then move forward, controlling what you can, move forward in love. You be that safe space for your kids, and just know it is going to probably be the hardest surrender ever to lose control of what the other person is doing. And yeah, I'm
Yeah.
sorry for those situations, but I do think kids will, right? And that's a decision that's going to be so personal and so individual, right? Do I stay married to prevent a really ugly divorce? Or is this, if divorce is our next step, like, what can I control? What can I do to keep living in line with, like, my core values? How can I show up for the kids? And it's just the reality of, right, your family situation. Like, the other parent might not be able to meet you in that more gracious space.
Yeah, I think also what I would add to that, because I mentioned that my parents had a high conflict divorce. And I saw, now looking back as an adult, I can see, oh, yeah, there's some things that happened here. There's no blame on my parents. This happened 25 years ago. We have a lot more information now. But like I am very thankful. My dad never talked poorly about my mom. Like, I thank him now. So like at the very least, like, know that it might not be soon, but like your kids will thank you one day for not talking negatively about the other parent, and just remaining as positive as possible, even despite, whatever is going on separately within like the divorce and the details with that. Your kids will thank you one day, because they'll be able to see
No.
that. And I know that it can get really tough too. I have friends who, are in that situation with a high conflict ex, and they're trying to do their best. And not to defend yourself when your kids come home and say something. I know how easy you want to defend yourself, right?
Mm-hmm.
But then it's ultimately, it's not doing anything other than hurting the kids at the end of the day. So it's tough. It's really tough when I think about it. And, but just trying to keep that in mind of like, this is like you're parenting, you're trying to co-parent, in a healthy way, not for your ex, but for your kids. I think that's
Yes.
important, and maybe what can help keep you going.
Yes. And I think that's so powerful. I can think of a handful of individuals right now that'd be so helpful to hear from someone who experienced a high conflict divorce. Because, I mean, talk about a massive exercise in delayed gratification, right? That it's going
Yeah.
to take your kids years, right? Decades, maybe, to process
Yeah.
and unpack their experience of that divorce. But if
Yeah.
you can keep showing up in line with like what you've decided is how you want to, right, parent your kids, that there will come a day they recognize that and acknowledge that, okay, this hurt right now in the here and now of not getting defensive, of not talking negatively about their other parent, that will pay off one day. Like, I
Yeah.
think that's such a good reminder. And that reminded me, you can tell me if I'm too off topic, but what you were saying, talking negatively about the other parent, I'm sure, I don't know if they've changed, I'm sure they've updated them, but you had to do the divorce education classes, right?
Yeah. Yeah. I had two.
So,
Yeah.
okay, I had two too.
Yeah.
Okay, so do they still have this? Stuck with me because it was one of those things I'm like, oh my goodness, Utah, I finally made this super difficult decision. And you were like talking me out of it because it was
Yeah.
so hard to watch, like so
It was.
hard to get through. And I felt so guilty. I just sat there crying. It's like, who goes to these in person? I'm so grateful there was like a virtual option because I would be a mess. But so was there, and it was a cartoon like illustration, but it was talking about just really harmful parental behaviors that hurt kids. And so
Mm.
it was using this analogy of a kid holding like a barbell over their head, and they would add weights to it of things. Really, they were illustrating like what parents should try to avoid through divorce. But one big one was one parent speaking negatively of the other parent, because for the kid, like, this is my mom, this is my dad, I love my mom, I love my dad. And so when you hear mom speak really negatively about dad or vice versa, you're literally adding these weights that your kid is not cognitively or emotionally capable of supporting, like that kind of
Yeah.
weight. So it literally, when it was a cartoon, like crushed the child, like just crushed under the weight of the things parents were putting them through. And anyways, so I just remember that. Maybe if you can visualize, like, I can't control, right, if their other parent is adding weight after weight, but maybe I can be a place that holds that with them. Or I'm going to do everything I possibly can to not add another weight
Yeah.
to something they're being forced to like carry with, our family through this season.
Yeah, I remember. So they do still have that illustration, at least a year ago.
I
So they probably still have it.
He probably saw
But
it.
yeah, it's a good visual though, and I like what you said.
Yeah.
Like maybe if the other parent is adding weight to it, if you're not adding additional weight on your end, then at least it's going to ease their load. There's not a lot that
Mm-hmm.
you can do about the weight that the other parent is adding, and hopefully, at some point you can get to a point where you can co-parent healthy. Maybe it's rocky in the beginning, and it's, I don't think
Mm-hmm.
that's everyone's story, that it's perfect from day one. And
Right.
also I'll talking about my parents, I'll just say this now. My parents, hang out all the time now. They've been divorced
Yeah.
over 20 years, and we go on family vacations together and we go to family dinners together. Like I saw both of them yesterday for my brother's birthday.
Oh,
And
that's
so
great.
there, even though their story was high conflict and there were a lot of emotions, 25 years ago, it's not like that now. And so it can change. So
It can
hang in there.
change.
It
I
can
love that.
change. It's not, it doesn't have to be a forever thing. Sometimes it takes some people a little bit of time to cool off and settle,
Mm-hmm.
and then you can move forward. But I like that visual that you illustrated there, Meg.
Yeah.
Okay, moving on to like talking to kids about divorce, because this is another top question that I get from people is
Mm-hmm.
like, okay, we're going to get divorced. We've talked about it. Like it's going to happen. Now, how do we handle this with our kids? So when would you say that it is time to have that discussion with your kids?
And this, I think, is a place where, and individual, it's going to be so individual, so personal, but do your research. I think I have my sweet sister. She's been my built in therapist. She's my younger sister long before she's an actual therapist. She's a licensed clinical social worker now. But I asked her, and you can ask, this is something you can ask the internet, you can ask. I have a few recommendations, just there's information out there, but I asked her for some books. So she recommended some books. My kids were younger. It's going to depend on the age of your kids. So that's going to be where you research, like specifically more your situation. I read the book, or I read the sections of the book that applied to my kids' ages because you have no time, right? So
Right.
you're like
Yeah,
desperate to
exactly.
have some answers, but I have like no time. So I went specifically, my kids were my goodness, how old were my kids? 9, 7, and 4. So I read those sections, kind of early childhood on the young end, middle, more middle for my older one. But it was how to talk to your kids about divorce. And it was so empowering. Like I made time for that because I'm like, I need to know what in the world to tell them. Like, what am I doing? And so I read that. I read a couple other things about just child centered communication. But the talk still, even when I went to write about my own experience of telling our kids, I just like had to keep revisiting that. It took me a while even to put it down in words because wherever that memory and that time resides in my mind, it is still so vivid and still all these years later, like painful. So talking to your kids about divorce, telling your kids that their parents are getting divorced is just unspeakably hard. I think for
Yeah.
me, it was the scariest thing of the whole process. I stayed married for years because I wanted to avoid that talk, right? I didn't
Yeah.
want to just shatter their worlds as they knew it.
Yeah.
So I read a lot with, we decided like for our situation, and this was the result of like researching, uh, talking to my co-parent, talking to my uncoupling coach, and coming up with a plan, which, and I know not everybody will have even that same luxury to come up with a plan. But again, I was fortunate. I did. We knew, kind of had an idea when he was going to be moving out. So for us, it made sense. We were going to tell them 2 weeks before dad was moving out. I really didn't want to just spring it on them and like all of a sudden, like dad's packing up and moving out tomorrow. I wanted to have them to have some time to kind of process with both of us, like all in the same home. But I also didn't want to tell them with, like, we knew long before that 2 weeks came, right? But I didn't want
Yeah.
them to live in this sad space of, right, heavy anticipation, just knowing it's coming, knowing it's coming. If kids see lots of like their parents arguing, it would make sense to tell them earlier, to talk about it earlier, to, right, have a different conversation. But for us, we told them 2 weeks before dad was moving out, and with the ages of our kids, we really, and this was in the literature, but we needed them to know 3 things. And it was actually so nice for me to give myself permission. It's like 3 things and these 3 things only. And I'm not going to let myself get distracted or overshare more or anything. Just 3 things, broken record. And that was like, we love you no matter what. Like, we love you. And we're always a family forever, right? And these are things that I'm like, I needed to read that because I'm like, duh, of course we're
Yeah.
still a family. But like young minds, and this is especially if my kids didn't know anyone whose parents were divorced, right? Both their grandparents are married and no friends. I think at the time, now it's changed a little bit, but at the time this was so foreign, and I knew it would be such a scary thing. So it was important to tell them, like, we'll always be a family. Divorce is a decision mom and dads make, and they decide to get divorced and not be married anymore. But there's no such thing for, and this was again our situation, parents divorcing kids, right?
Right.
That doesn't happen. If you are a single parent, where that looks different, right? Maybe one parent has like taken off, isn't in the picture, that conversation, that part will look different, but you can still reassure them that like you aren't going anywhere. And
Yeah.
then the third thing was, this has nothing to do with you, right? So we
Yeah.
love you, we're always a family, this has nothing to do with you. And we repeated those things in some form or another, and that talk was just, yeah, it was horrible. I can still remember the crying. I can remember my one
Mm.
middle daughter just kind of, just her tone of voice raw with emotion and panic. And just my 4-year-old was young enough to not totally understand what was happening, but could look to her siblings and know like this was really bad news.
Right.
It was just, nothing will prepare you for that. Katie and I know you and Katie have talked about this, countless things with divorce I was not ready for, right?
Yeah.
This talk being the biggest. I would never, ever, ever feel ready for that talk. But you reach a point where like ready is a decision, not a
Mm-hmm.
feeling. And we
Yeah.
just had to decide when to have the talk. I mean, first you decide when you're getting divorced, you decide when you're going to tell kids, you decide the new living situation. You have so many decisions that, yeah, you're just never ready for, but they need to be made.
Yeah.
And yeah, that talk was one of them. So I would say, kind of on this subject, talking to your kids about divorce, it was, and it's not like you have the talk, it's not like one and done,
Yeah.
right? Like it's going to
Yeah.
need revisiting, and then that will change with time too. But so it was a couple years later, and I think I had just gotten comfortable in my assumption that like we are doing relatively well. I feel like the kids are thriving. Things that I was like so terrified of when we first decided to divorce. Like, what if they, abandon these beloved hobbies? Or what if they start struggling in school? Or what if, like, all these things that I was terrified of, I'm like, no, they're doing so well. They're thriving. They're great. And things, anyway, 2 years later, out of the blue, my now 11-year-old son asks me while we're driving to like some sports practice, and he's like, why'd you and dad get divorced? And it just like, I tried to like appear calm and unshaken, but it just threw me back into that talk 2 years ago, such a different space. And it's like, well, what do I tell him? Where's my book? He's 2 years older. I don't know what to do.
Yeah.
I haven't prepared for this. And so I did. I kind of froze. And I mean, I told him, I was like, I'm so glad you asked me. We are really open, can talk about anything. But I was like, I don't have a great answer right now. I repeated the things we said 2 years ago. I could tell he was disappointed, probably hoping I
Yeah.
forgot that, recorded response. But those things are still and will always be true. So I wanted to reiterate those things. We love you. We're always a family. It had nothing to do with you. I really believe this will make more sense for all of us at some point, but I'm sorry. I don't have a better answer. And
Yeah.
then a couple weeks later, I have the most wise, another therapist friend, and we were skiing, and I brought it up to her, and I was like, I don't know what to tell him. I'm so scared to answer that question, right? I didn't even think I would be, face to face with it again. And she was so incredible. And I share this because I feel like this wisdom is gold, and it's also so liberating for the whole family. But she just reminded me, she's like, your reasons, Meg, or Brandon's reasons, my former husband, behind the divorce are unique and individual. You might have some shared understanding, right? But they're still like, your reasons are so personal, and they're kind of still evolving, right? Like what I answered right now, even when you asked me about like when we got divorced, how we know to get divorced, it's so different than probably what I definitely different than what I would have answered, right? The day
Yeah.
we decided to get divorced. So she just reminded me, like, that's my experience to integrate and make sense of. And your kids don't need your story of the divorce. They think they're asking for reasons. They are. He was, saying why, but they're
Yeah.
really looking for support, making sense of their own experience.
Yeah.
Right. Like, so she just encouraged me, like, ask him questions, right? What's it like for you that your parents are divorced? What's it like for you that, right, you're probably one of your only friends whose parents aren't married, but they're good friends. I know you get questions about that, which my kids do. What's it? Just tell me about your experience of this. And again, it took me a few days to get brave enough to reopen that with my son, because, like, that's scary,
Yeah.
right? But, like, I'm scared. And I'm scared of his answers. I'm scared of hearing that, divorce was this, this, and this for him. But it's
Yeah.
not about me, right? It's about showing up and holding space and helping your kids process and make sense. And then but this conversation was the most miraculous post-divorce thing. Because when I asked him that, like, he thought about it for a minute, and he's like, what's it like for you that, dad and I are divorced? And he said, I was really sad at first. Like, he had memories of being really sad. He's like, and I didn't know what would happen. And I didn't know how much we'd still see dad. And he's just 11. He's super easygoing, super fun loving, just happy kid. He's like, but I still see dad all this time and we still do stuff
Mm.
together. And it just kind of seems like everything's better this way. And I was like,
Oh.
instantly, like, and he just is like talking like he didn't just say the most amazing thing I've ever heard, right? Like, I was
Yeah.
instantly, something changed. It was just lighter. And that was, I think I mentioned earlier, that was the story of him kind of speaking in just this 11-year-old language, what he felt at home, like what he felt. He was just like, but now I guess everything's kind of better this way. And
Yeah.
so he noticed that ultimately, like, this has been a good thing. He had memories
Yeah.
of it being really hard. And then he could recognize that the family collectively seemed better. So, all
Yeah.
that to say, I think, kind of decide what makes sense to tell your kids based on their ages, based on what they've seen
Yeah.
between you and their other parent. And questions are right. Like, you can always turn it back, like, how are you feeling? What do you think about this?
Yeah.
And then just be there to kind of, yeah, validate their
Yeah.
pain, the family's loss. And right, you can't just blanket it with, it's going to be okay, we're going to be better, we're all going to heal, right? It has to be
Right.
that heavy, sad stages of grief that you all will revisit for some time. But then also, right, being the parent is so hard, but you also have to model, like, but we can do hard things, like, but
Yeah.
we will be okay, right? It is just so much of that holding both. It is really painful and really hard and really sad, but there's also hope and moving forward, and we have each other.
Yeah. Well, that's all you can really hope for as a parent. And I'm sure when your son said that to you, it's like all of this hard work is paying off, that he feels this way. And it doesn't always feel that way as a parent, even if you
Right.
are co parenting and you keep telling yourself over and over, like, this is the best way for the kids, like, they're going to be fine because this is better overall. I just think about my own daughter, my 6-year old. So I was kind of in a similar place too, where when we separated, my girls were 2 and 5, and so we didn't have a lot of those really strong emotions. My 2-year old had no idea what
Right.
any of this meant, and my 5-year old at the time, she didn't really have a lot of questions. She was just like, okay. And then some questions came in the days after, just kind of randomly. And then recently, she's 6, she'll almost 7. She started asking those questions too, like, why did you and dad divorce, or why aren't you and dad married
Why aren't
anymore?
you married?
Yeah, and I did the same thing, as asked, and it took me off guard. I wasn't prepared for that in the
Yeah.
moment. Like, we were going to bed and I didn't know what to say, but just it's helped, asking her those questions, like, why do you want me and dad to be married? And
Right.
then she said, it's hard going back between two homes. And I dug in a little more and said, why is it hard going between two homes? And she said that she missed certain things at my house. And I mean, that she misses both parents too.
Mm-hmm.
But then you can kind of just explore like, what is their experience like? And maybe there are some things that you can do to make it easier. You can't fix it, but there might be some things that you can do to better support them. So I think that's really helpful. The other thing that and I know you talked about this in your book and you reminded me of it, but you said like to be mindful of like when your kids ask these questions, when they're wondering why you got divorced, like sometimes your answer, you got to make sure that it's appropriate for their age. And it's I know I'm not like explaining this like very well,
No,
but
you're
in order for them to like process like what's happening, you don't need to give them like all the nitty gritty details about why you and your ex are divorcing,
right.
right? What you
Right.
tell them is really just to like support them, and make
Mm.
them feel comfortable through the process, and not tell them really any details. I don't even, I mean, I could
Yeah.
be wrong here, but maybe not even saying things like, we just didn't get along anymore. Maybe
Yeah.
you shouldn't even say something like that.
And I think that's such a good point. And this is where really perspective taking is huge. And even just familiarizing yourself a little bit with developmental stages of childhood. Because if you think like the ages of your girls and even the ages of my kids, their concept of love is like what they feel for their family, what they feel for their pets, what they feel. So you can't go in with your reasoning because they just don't have the context to make that make sense. Right.
Yeah.
So, like your 2 year old, those young kids, they're kind of like, but who's getting me cereal in the morning? Right. Like
Yeah.
that's what they need to know. That's what they're going to be wondering. Like, what does my day to day look like? Who's picking me up from school? Where am I staying? They don't need these adult reasons. Again,
Yeah.
older kids, that
Yeah.
might look different, but still, like, what do they need to hear in order to make sense of what's happening, in order to move forward, in order to heal? We don't want, I think sometimes, and I've heard different parents just talk about needing it to be really honest and needing it to be, which I value honesty and transparency and all those things. But I think through the lens of, but what does my child in the here and now need to feel safe, to feel loved, to feel like this is going to be okay?
Yeah.
And it'll be, right, a huge change regardless, but we don't, anything we can do to not add confusion to an already super confusing time. And just remember, tons of our work will be, right, showing up to just be there and be a safe space for them.
Yeah.
And this was another thing my uncoupling coach reminded me, that you want, or you think you want so much to protect them and maybe give them some narrative of this, and that's not your job, right? Like, this is their story now, right? My kid's story, my parents got divorced when I was 9, when I was 7, when I was 4, right? Like, you have your story of your parents' divorce, and that's going to be their work to do, and you can help them make sense of it with questions, help them talk about it. I should say, it took me a while to ask my girls the same question, to ask them about it. And I thought about waiting for them to bring it up, but then what if they never brought it up and needed somebody to kind of model talking about things that feel uncomfortable to talk about? And because I know they encounter it often, they're asked about it at school or it comes up. And anyway, so I should say, when I asked them about it, their answers weren't nearly as like miraculous as my sons. If anything, their answers hurt more, right? That
Yeah.
there was still lots of sadness. They wish their parents were married. They
Of
wish that
course.
their mom went to, right, my former in-laws house with them. They wish that
Right.
their parents didn't live in different places. They wish, but at least they had somewhere. But again, like, that wasn't about me. That was me acknowledging, like, that is hard.
Well, I have another question. Something that comes up quite a bit on my account as well is like, oh, you're able to co-parent well with your ex because you and your ex aren't. There's no one else in the mix. Like, there's no step parents. There's not another woman. There's not this. Like, this will change. Have you personally gone through that part of co-parenting and what you can expect when there's another person in the mix? And what recommendations would you have for anyone who is navigating like a step parent relationship?
So, so many thoughts in this. I will say, when I wrote about any of this, I very specifically wrote my divorce memoir. Sorry, losing that again, because I didn't want it to be at all preachy. I didn't want it to be like, do it this way and do it this way. Like, this is just my story of it. And so when I share, like, my uncoupling coach, for example, her challenge to me, I don't even know if I should call it a challenge. Her suggestion to me was 6 to 9, it turned into 9 months, but 6 months of you throwing yourself into the work of healing, right? Not pursuing outside relationships, not just you focused on you focused on your relationship with your kids, you focused on what co-parenting is going to look like, you wrap your head around this new normal. So I did not have to deal with that right away. And I can't say that this was a good suggestion because it was made from such a place of scarcity on my end. But divorce is traumatic. Like, you really, by the time you and your former partner are dissolving a marriage, I think it's probably a safe assumption that they are not a safe space for you. They don't feel like a safe person. You have no idea what direction they're going to head kind of in the wake of this massive change and hurt. And so I had no idea what he was going to do. In my mind, he was going to be like dating a 21-year-old aerospace engineer. Like, that was the field he was working in when we got divorced. So I like would spiral and try to, even though I had tools to stop that. But I was so nervous for other people being involved that in our divorce decree, we agreed to write in that kids wouldn't meet a new partner for a year post-divorce. And that's not to say we couldn't be out and dating or meeting whoever, but kids wouldn't be asked to meet somebody new. And
Yeah.
we both agreed, like, that's a reasonable ask, right? Even if, because we're going to have this like alone single parent time when kids are with the other parent, so I'm like not trying to control what he's doing at all. But it was important to me that I knew kids would have a year to kind of
Yeah.
adjust to their parents not being married. And again, I can't recommend that because it was such a such a scarcity request.
Yeah.
But then in hindsight, I also feel like it was kind of genius because I do think it gave us space to rebuild relationships with our kids as single parents, and then also just work on this relationship between us as co-parents. I don't know. It's hard to see your former partner with somebody else,
Yeah.
even if it's like in the wisest part of yourself. Like, you want them to heal, you want them to be happy. You can acknowledge, like, I should have never been the source of somebody else's happiness anyway. So why would I
Yeah.
ever be offended that they're pursuing that without me? Like, it has nothing to do with me. Like, I'm just responsible for myself, but it's still hard. And so I
Yeah.
think when you layer that, and I know this is an unpopular opinion, but when you layer that on top of all the hurt that comes with ending a marriage and the conversations with kids, and like, you're spread so thin that I think it's hard to bring somebody else in right away.
I think so too, because as like a child of divorce, my dad got remarried the same year that my parents got
Wow.
divorced. And I've thought a lot about this now that I've gone through my own divorce, and like, where does my trauma come from? Like, what really happened, you know? And I can't say for sure, but I do feel like a lot of the trauma that I experienced and where a lot of the conflict came from my parents, I do feel like it was a result of my dad when he got remarried, because he did remarry very quickly. I remember some things about my parents when they first divorced, but I really remember once my dad introduced us to his fiance. He got engaged 4 months after their
Oh.
divorce and then married 10 months later. As a child, it was really hard to process that. And so I don't
Mm-hmm.
think that comes from like a scarcity mindset, like
Okay.
you said. I think that's actually very mature. And I think that it gives your kids time to process and heal and adjust to their new normal and not have those feelings of, oh, dad or mom has a new family. Can you let people know where to find you and talk about your book, your coaching program, just all the things?
Yes, thank you. You can find my website at megcampbellcoaching.com. And then from there, you can get all the book details, the memoir of my divorce story. And I am slowly, and you know this, I kind of have just more organically started talking to individuals uncoupling, and then which I've loved and have had people, it's like the biggest compliment that I think anyone would even suggest somebody talk to me about that. But it has become enough that I've tried to get more intentional and systematic about it. So that's the website, but it's all brand new. The book is going to be launched early June. And
Hey.
yeah, details on the website. I'm so excited, and thank you so much for letting me talk about it.
Yeah. Oh, thank you so much for joining. I'm going to link everything in the show notes. And then by the time this episode releases, your book will be released. So I will get the
Oh,
link to your
yay.
book as
Okay.
well and put it in the show notes so people can very easily find it. And thanks again so much for joining us today.
Yes, thank you so much, Galen.